I never thought I'd be sitting alone in my garden at 73, watching the winter birds peck at the feeder while wondering if my own children understand what they've thrown away. Not just things, porcelain and silver and aged wood, but pieces of our history, fragments of who we are. My name is Irene Davis, and for most of my life, I've been known as many things. A respected art conservator, a devoted wife to my late husband Edward, and a mother to my 3 children. But lately, I've been feeling like a ghost in my own family story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up surrounded by beautiful things. My grandmother Eloise was a collector of fine antiques and art, not the kind you'd find in museums necessarily, but pieces with stories, with souls. She taught me to see beyond the surface of objects, to feel the hands that crafted them, to sense the lives they'd witnessed. "These aren't just things, Irene," she'd say, her fingers tracing the curved arm of a rosewood chair. "They're witnesses. They've outlived their makers and their first owners, and they'll outlive us too." When she died, she left her collection to me, along with a peculiar provision in her will. "The collection stays intact until your children turn 50, the lawyer read from the yellowed paper. "Only then may they know its true value." I was 36 at the time, with 3 young children, Victoria, then 15, James, 13, and Rebecca, just 10. The collection moved into our home, filling rooms with beauty and the faint scent of lemon oil and history. Edward and I were comfortable but not wealthy. He worked as a university professor while I restored paintings and antiques from our converted garage studio. The extra income helped send the children to good schools and eventually colleges. We never touched my grandmother's collection, treating it as something sacred, a trust passed down. I maintained each piece meticulously, teaching my children about their provenance, the stories behind them, hoping they'd develop the same appreciation I had. "Mom's at it again with the dust cloth and the boring old furniture," Victoria would joke to her siblings when she thought I couldn't hear. Of my 3 children, only Rebecca showed any genuine interest, sitting beside me as I cleaned the patina on a Georgian silver tea service or gently restored the gilt on an antique picture frame. "Will these be mine someday?" she'd ask, her small fingers hovering just above the surface of a delicate porcelain figurine. "They'll belong to all of you," I'd explain, "when the time is right." Edward passed away 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack while grading papers at his desk. The children rallied around me at first, coming by with casseroles and concerned expressions. But as weeks turned to months, their visits became less frequent. Victoria was busy with her corporate career in Boston, James with his restaurant in DI Chicago, and Rebecca with her growing family in Portland. I understood. They had lives of their own. What I didn't understand was the shift in their attitudes when they learned that Edward had left them very little. Our house was paid off, and I had my modest pension and savings. But there wasn't a substantial inheritance. "Dad didn't leave anything for us?" Victoria had asked, her voice tight with something I didn't want to recognize as disappointment. "We didn't have much beyond what you see," I explained. "The house, my restoration work, his professor's salary. We put everything into raising you 3. She'd nodded, but there was a coolness between us afterward, a faint barrier I couldn't seem to breach. James was more direct. "I just thought there'd be something to help with the restaurant expansion," he said during a rare visit. "The location I want just came on the market, and the timing." I found myself apologizing for our lack of wealth, for not having planned better, for disappointing them. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were sitting among treasures they couldn't recognize. 2 years after Edward's death, I suffered a fall. Nothing dramatic, a missed step on the garden path, but enough to fracture my hip and raise concerns about my living alone. After weeks in physical therapy, I returned to find a stack of glossy brochures on my kitchen counter. "We found some really nice retirement communities," Victoria informed me over dinner that evening. She, James, and Rebecca had coordinated a rare simultaneous visit. "This one even has an art studio." "I don't need a retirement community," I said, setting down my fork. "I'm managing just fine." "Mom, you fell," James pointed out. "You were alone for almost an hour before Mrs. Finley heard you calling for help." "I've taken precautions," I insisted. "I have the emergency button now, and I've moved my bedroom downstairs." "It's not just about physical safety," Rebecca added, her expression gentler than her siblings. "It's about quality of life. There would be people your age, activities, support." I looked at my children, sitting in my dining room among the antiques they'd grown up with but never truly seen. The Chippendale chairs they sat on, the mahogany table where their elbows rested, the Tiffany lamp casting its amber glow, all pieces from my grandmother's collection, all with stories and histories they'd dismissed as boring old furniture. "This is my home," I said firmly. "Our home. Your father and I built our life here, and these things," I gestured to the room around us, "they're our history." Victoria sighed, that little exhale of frustration I'd come to recognize well. "Mom, you can't take all this stuff to a retirement community anyway. We'd need to sell most of it." "Or divide it up," James suggested. "I could use some things for the restaurant. That old sideboard would look great in the private dining room." I felt a chill creep through me. "These pieces aren't to be separated," I said. "They're part of Grandmother Eloise's collection." "That old rule?" Victoria rolled her eyes. "Mom, Grandmother's been gone for over 40 years. No one's enforcing her will now." "I am," I said quietly. The conversation moved on, but I could feel something shift that evening, a subtle rebalancing of power. They began looking at the collection differently, not with newfound appreciation, but with assessment, calculation. When they thought I wasn't watching, they'd turn over plates to check for maker's marks or pull out drawers to inspect dovetail joints. I held my ground about staying in my home, but I could sense their patience wearing thin. They arranged for a home health aide to come 3 times a week, just to help with the heavy cleaning, Mom. But I knew it was also to report back on my condition. Mariana was kind, though, and I enjoyed her company more than I let on to. My children. Last spring, Rebecca called with news. Her husband Tyler had received a job offer in Switzerland, a 2-year contract with an international bank. "That's wonderful, darling," I said, genuinely happy for them. "The thing is, Mom, we're putting most of our things in storage, and the apartment in Zurich comes partially furnished, but—" She hesitated. "We could really use some nice pieces to make it feel like home. Just a few things from here that you might not be using." "What kind of things?" I asked cautiously. "Maybe the blue and white porcelain collection, the pieces in the guest bedroom, and possibly that small writing desk in the library." I felt my throat tighten. The porcelain was Ming Dynasty, part of a matched set my grandmother had spent decades assembling. The writing desk was a rare Queen Anne piece with a documented provenance. "Those are part of the collection, Rebecca," I reminded her. "They stay together." "Mom, they're just sitting there," she argued, her voice taking on that patience with the difficult elder tone I'd grown to despise. "No one sees them but you. Wouldn't you rather know they're being used and appreciated?" I stood firm, but the request lingered between us, souring our weekly calls. A month later, James visited, admiring the pair of Georgian silver candelabra that had always stood on the dining room sideboard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "These would be perfect for the chef's table experience we're launching," he mentioned, lifting one to examine its hallmarks. "Very on brand for our new menu concept." They're not brand accessories, James, I said sharply. They're family heirlooms. He set the candelabra down with a clunk that made me wince. Family heirlooms are meant to be passed down, Mom, not hoarded. That word, hoarded, struck me like a physical blow. Is that how they saw me? As some senile old woman clutching at objects for no reason? Victoria's approach was more direct. During her Christmas visit, she brought up the topic of estate pre-planning. It's really the responsible thing, Mom, she explained, sliding a sleek folder across the coffee table. Making decisions now about who gets what saves so much trouble later. Later, I repeated flatly. She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. You know what I mean. It's just practical, and if you decided to gift some things now, there are tax advantages. I left the folder untouched. The collection stays intact, I said for what felt like the 100th time. Victoria's frustration finally boiled over. This obsession with the collection is ridiculous. Grandmother's been dead for decades. That provision in her will isn't legally binding anymore. We're your children, Mom. Don't you want us to have nice things? To benefit from what you have while you're still alive to see it? I looked at my eldest daughter, so competent and accomplished in her tailored slacks and cashmere sweater, yet so blind to what was right in front of her. Yes, I said quietly, I do want you to benefit, but there are some things you don't understand yet. She threw up her hands. Then explain it to me. What is so special about these things that they can't be separated? Why can't we just divide them up now? I nearly told her then. The words were on the tip of my tongue, the truth about the collection, about my grandmother's real legacy. But I remembered Eloise's firm belief that some knowledge wasn't a gift if given too soon. She'd had her reasons for the 50-year provision, and I would honor them. It's complicated, was all I said. Just trust me when I say the collection needs to stay intact until the time is right. Victoria left the next day, earlier than planned, with a chilly goodbye. Rebecca called a week later to tell me they'd found other furniture for their Zurich apartment. James didn't mention the candelabra again. The subject of the collection became a silent fault line running through our family relationships. Unspoken, but ever present. I should have seen what was coming. Perhaps some part of me did, but didn't want to believe my children capable of such disregard. It began with small things disappearing when I returned from a week-long visit to my sister in Arizona. A pair of miniature portraits from the upstairs hallway, a small jade figurine from the library, then larger pieces, the Sheraton side table from the guest room, the George III mirror from the entryway. When I called Victoria to ask if she knew anything about the missing items, her response was careful, practiced. We thought it was best to start distributing a few things, Mom. For safekeeping. Safekeeping, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. You're alone in that big house with all these valuable things, she explained. It's not secure. Who took what? I demanded. A sigh. Mom, does it really matter? They're staying in the family. But it did matter. It mattered tremendously. The collection wasn't just a random assortment of antiques. It was curated, documented, each piece connected to the others in ways my children couldn't understand because they'd never bothered to learn. Over the next few months, the trickle became a stream. Each time I left the house for more than a day, I'd return to find something else missing. They were coordinating, I realized, taking turns, careful not to take too much at once, probably hoping I wouldn't notice or would be too confused to keep track. I began documenting the disappearances, photographing empty spaces, making lists. When I confronted them on our monthly family video call, they closed ranks. Mom, we're just being practical, Victoria said. These things were going to be divided eventually. You're always saying you want us to appreciate the collection, James added. That's exactly what we're doing. Rebecca at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. We thought it would be easier this way, she said softly. Less stressful for you than doing it all at once. I looked at their faces on my computer screen, my children, whom I'd raised to be honest and respectful, and felt something inside me crack. Do you even know what you've taken? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger and disappointment coursing through me. The provenance of these pieces, their significance, how they relate to one another? They exchanged glances and I had my answer. You've refused to discuss dividing things fairly, Victoria said defensively. We had to do something. Fairly, I echoed. You don't even know what you have. I ended the call abruptly, something I'd never done before. Sitting in my increasingly empty home, surrounded by the gaps where generations of history had stood, I made a decision. The next morning I called my lawyer, Margaret Chen, who had been handling my affairs since Edward passed. We'd become friends over the years, sharing a love of art and history. She was one of the few people who knew the truth about my grandmother's collection. They've been taking pieces, I told her, my voice tight with suppressed emotion. Behind my back when I'm away from the house. Margaret's response was immediate and heated. That's theft, Irene. We should call the police. They're my children, I said, the words aching in my chest. And they think they're just redistributing what would eventually be theirs anyway. But they don't know, do they? Margaret asked more gently. About the trust? No, I confirmed. Eloise was adamant about that. Not until they're 50, or I'm gone. Whichever comes first. Victoria was 49, just a year away from the revelation. But a year suddenly seemed too long to wait. What do you want to do? Margaret asked. I closed my eyes, imagining my grandmother's reaction to this situation. Eloise had been formidable, clear-eyed, never one to shy away from hard truths. She would expect me to protect her legacy, not just the objects themselves, but the principle behind them. I want you to prepare the documents, I said, opening my eyes. They've made their choice without having all the information. Now they need to understand the consequences. Are you sure? Margaret pressed. This will change everything. They've already changed everything, I replied. I'm just making it official. As I hung up the phone, I gazed around my living room. The spaces where treasures had once stood seemed to pulse with absence. But I felt a strange calm settling over me. For decades, I'd been the keeper of secrets, the guardian of a legacy my children hadn't earned the right to know. Now, whether they were ready or not, the truth would have its day. I walked to my desk and began composing 3 identical letters, my hand steady despite the heaviness in my heart. Dear Victoria, James, Rebecca, I wrote, there's something you need to know about your grandmother Eloise's collection. The most painful part wasn't losing the antiques themselves. It was realizing that my children saw these treasures as mere objects to possess, rather than pieces of our shared history to preserve. In taking them without understanding, they'd broken more than just their grandmother's rule. They'd severed a connection to their own past. And soon, they would learn exactly what that would cost them. The next morning brought clarity as sharp as winter sunlight. I sat at my kitchen table, the 3 sealed envelopes before me, each bearing one of my children's names in my careful handwriting. Inside each was an invitation, or perhaps more accurately, a summons, to meet at my home the following Saturday. Important family matters to discuss, I'd written. Attendance is not optional. Their responses came quickly, too quickly for them to have consulted each other. Victoria had a client meeting, but would try to rearrange. James mentioned a busy weekend at the restaurant, but would make it work somehow. Rebecca, still in Switzerland, said she'd join by video call despite the time difference. I'd expected resistance, negotiation. Their relative compliance suggested they sensed something had changed. Perhaps they'd noticed a new tone in my voice, a firmness that had been absent before. Or maybe they simply worried I'd discovered even more of their thefts than I'd let on. What they couldn't know was that I had spent decades preparing for this moment, even if I'd hoped it would never come. Eloise hadn't just left me beautiful objects, she'd left me a responsibility, a trust that extended far beyond the physical collection. And while I had tried to instill that sense of stewardship in my children, I had clearly failed. That afternoon, I asked Mariana to help me move several albums and folders from the attic to the dining room. She chatted as we worked, telling me about her daughter's college applications, seemingly oblivious to the significance of what we were handling. "These look important," she remarked, setting down a leather portfolio embossed with the name of a prestigious auction house. "They are," I said simply. "Family history." When Saturday arrived, I dressed with particular care. A silk blouse I'd bought in Florence on my last anniversary trip with Edward, pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I wasn't trying to impress my children, but to remind myself of who I was, not just their mother, but the granddaughter of Eloise Harrington, keeper of a legacy they had yet to understand. James arrived first, bringing a peace offering of pastries from his restaurant. He kissed my cheek, his eyes doing a quick inventory of the room, noting what else might be missing since his last visit. "The house looks different," he commented, trying to sound casual. "Yes," I agreed. "It does." Victoria arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing briskly about traffic while typing a final email on her phone. Only when she looked up did she register the formal table setting, the folders placed at each position, the sober expression on my face. "What's going on, Mom?" she asked, glancing at James, who shrugged. "We'll start once Rebecca joins us," I said, gesturing to the laptop I'd set up at one end of the table. Right on time, the video call rang, and Rebecca's face appeared on screen, squinting against what appeared to be early morning light in her Zurich apartment. "Mom? James? Vic?" she said, her voice tinny through the speakers. "I'm here." I took my seat at the head of the table, where Edward had always sat for family dinners. It felt right, somehow, to take his place for this conversation. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've asked you here because there's something important we need to discuss about Grandmother Eloise's collection." They exchanged glances, guilty, wary, defensive. "Mom, if..." "This is about the pieces we've borrowed," Victoria started. "Borrowed," I repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. "Is that what you call taking things without permission when the owner is away?" James shifted uncomfortably. "We were going to inherit them eventually." "Were you?" I asked quietly. "That stopped them." Rebecca leaned closer to her camera. "What do you mean?" "Before we continue, I want each of you to tell me exactly what you've taken from this house in the past 6 months. And don't bother denying it or minimizing. I have a complete inventory with photographs." The silence stretched for several seconds before James spoke. "The silver candelabra," he admitted. "And that small oil painting from the upstairs hall. The one with the sailing ships. And the rosewood tea caddy." "The Georgian writing desk from the library," Victoria added reluctantly. "The set of leather-bound Shakespeare volumes. The small Persian rug from the guest room." Rebecca looked miserable on screen. "The blue and white porcelain collection," she said softly. "The jade figurines. And that small painted chest from the landing." I nodded, checking items off my mental list. They'd been thorough, diving the spoils among themselves with surprising equity. "And did any of you consult the documentation about these pieces before taking them? The provenance records? The collection inventory?" More uncomfortable silence. "I'll take that as a no," I said. "Did it occur to any of you that these pieces might be more than just pretty antiques? That they might have significance beyond their aesthetic appeal?" Victoria frowned. "Mom, we know they're valuable." "No," I cut her off. "You don't know. You've never known, because you've never bothered to learn. I opened the folder in front of me and removed a stack of papers, sliding a copy toward each of my children, with Rebecca's set beside the laptop for her to see. This is the complete inventory of Eloise Harrington's collection, with current market valuations as of last month, I explained. Not the insurance appraisals you might have glimpsed over the years, but the true auction values. They leaned forward almost in unison, eyes widening as they scanned the documents. "This can't be right," Victoria said, her voice faint. "This says the writing desk is worth $340,000, I finished for her. Yes, it's one of only 7 known examples, and the only one with its original hardware intact. James had gone pale. The candelabra are listed at nearly $200,000. For the pair, yes, I confirmed. They were made for the Duke of Marlborough in 1738. Rebecca was silent, but I could see her eyes moving. Rapidly over the document, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. "The total value of the collection is just over $17 million, I said, allowing that number to land fully. Or rather, it was before you decided to dismantle it piece by piece. The room went completely still. Even through the screen, I could see the blood drain from Rebecca's face. 17 million? James repeated, his voice cracking. But that's not possible. We would have known. How would you have known? I asked. You never showed any interest. When I tried to teach you about these pieces, you were too busy, too bored, too certain there was nothing of value to learn. Victoria had recovered her composure somewhat, her analytical mind already working. If these valuations are accurate, why have these pieces been sitting in our family home all these years? Why weren't they in a museum or a secure facility? It was a fair question, perhaps the first thoughtful one any of them had asked about the collection. Because that's not what Eloise wanted, I explained. She believed art and antiques should be lived with, not locked away. But she also believed in stewardship, in preserving these pieces for future generations who would appreciate them properly. I removed another document from my folder. This is the trust agreement established by your great-grandmother in 1975, before any of you were born. It specifies that the collection must remain intact until her great-grandchildren, meaning you 3, reach the age of 50, or until my death, whichever comes first. Victoria, always the quickest, already saw where this was heading. And what happens if the collection doesn't remain intact? I met her gaze directly. Then the trust is dissolved, and the entire remaining collection, along with the proceeds from its sale, revert to the Harrington Foundation for Historic Preservation. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Rebecca's video feed seemed frozen, though I could see her blinking rapidly, processing this information. You're saying we've lost our inheritance, James finally said, his voice hollow. I'm saying you've broken the terms of the trust by removing pieces without authorization. Before the specified time, I corrected. And yes, the consequences for that are severe. This is ridiculous, Victoria snapped, anger replacing her shock. You can't just spring this on us now after all these years. Why didn't you tell us? I tried, I said simply. Every time. I spoke about provenance, about the collection's importance, about keeping it together. That was me trying to tell you. You chose not to listen. But $17 million, Rebecca whispered through the screen. That's life-changing money. It would have been, I agreed. For all of you. Victoria was less than a year away from turning 50. The trust would have matured, and you would have learned everything then. James stood abruptly, pacing the length of the dining room. There must be a way to fix this. We can bring everything back, put it all exactly where it was. I shook my head. The trust document is very specific. Once pieces are removed without authorization, the breach cannot be remedied. You're our mother, Victoria said, her voice tight with accusation. You're really going to let this happen? Let some foundation take our inheritance? Her words stung, but I held firm. I'm your mother, yes, but I'm also the trustee of Eloise's legacy. I've spent my entire adult life honoring that responsibility, cataloging, preserving, protecting. All you had to do was wait, or listen, or care enough to understand what was right in front of you. We didn't know, Rebecca pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. No, I agreed softly. You didn't know, because you chose not to. I slid the final document across the table, a letter from Margaret Chen confirming that the breach of trust had been officially recorded, and the process of transferring the collection to the Harrington Foundation had begun. The foundation will be sending representatives next week to assess and document the remaining pieces, I explained. You will each need to return everything you've taken, with evidence that the items haven't been damaged. Victoria's face had hardened into the expression she used for difficult negotiations. And if we refuse? I met her gaze steadily. Then it becomes a criminal matter, Victoria. Theft of items valued at over $10,000 is a felony in this state. James sank back into his chair, head in his hands. I don't believe this is happening. For several long minutes, no one spoke. Outside, I could hear birds at the feeder, the distant hum of a lawnmower, life continuing normally while inside my dining room. My children's understanding of their future was being fundamentally rewritten. What about you? Rebecca finally asked, her voice small. Mom, where does this leave you? It was the first question any of them had asked about my welfare rather than their own, and it softened something in me. I'll be fine, I assured her. The house is mine outright. I have my pension and my savings, and Eloise made provision for the trustee to remain in the family home with the collection for life, if desired. So you get to keep living with everything while we get nothing, Victoria summarized bitterly. I get to continue being the steward of a legacy you rejected, I corrected gently. There's a difference. I gathered the papers back into my folder, signaling that the formal part of our meeting was concluded. I've ordered lunch from Bellini's, I said, standing. It should be here soon. Why don't we move to the living room while we wait? They followed me in shocked silence, moving like sleepwalkers. In the living room, the empty spaces where treasures had once stood seemed to mock us all. A lighter rectangle on the wall where the Dutch still life had hung. The imprint of claw feet on the carpet where the Pembroke table had stood. As we sat, Rebecca finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. Why did Grandmother Eloise set up the trust this way? Why the secrecy? Why wait until we were 50? I smiled sadly. Eloise believed that true appreciation for history and beauty couldn't be forced or rushed. It had to be earned through time and attention. She hoped that by 50, you would have developed that appreciation on your own, that you would understand the value of these pieces beyond their monetary worth. That's incredibly condescending, Victoria muttered. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps it was wisdom. She'd seen too many fortunes squandered by those who received them too easily or too early. She wanted more for you than that. James looked up, his expression shifting from despair to curiosity. The Harrington Foundation, that's named after her? I nodded. She established it before I was born. It funds restoration projects, supports museums in acquiring important pieces, trains conservators. The work is remarkable. So the collection won't just disappear into some vault, he said slowly. It will be used for something meaningful. Yes, I confirmed, surprised and touched by his insight. In fact, many of the pieces will likely be loaned to museums where they can be properly appreciated. Victoria was still processing, her analytical mind searching for solutions. Is there no appeal process? No way to contest this? Eloise's lawyers were very thorough, I said. The trust has been challenged before, by distant relatives who felt excluded. It held firm. We sat in silence again, each lost in our own thoughts. I watched my children's faces, the shock giving way to other emotions: anger, regret, resignation. For the first time in years, they weren't performing or calculating or positioning. They were simply present, forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The doorbell rang, announcing our lunch delivery. As I rose to answer it, Rebecca's voice came softly through the laptop speakers. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not for losing the money, though God knows that's devastating, but for not understanding, for not seeing what was right in front of me all these years." Her words broke something open inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. The beginning of a new understanding between us. In the hallway, I paused before a small oil portrait of Eloise that had somehow escaped my children's attention. She gazed back at me with those keen blue eyes that missed nothing, her expression both stern and loving. "I did what you asked," I whispered to her image. "I kept the collection intact as long as I could. I tried to teach them. And now we start again." I opened the front door to accept our lunch delivery, aware that on the other side of this painful day lay a different kind of relationship with my children. One built not on inheritance or obligation, but on more honest ground. They would be angry for a while. They would blame me, call me cruel or heartless. But eventually, if I was lucky, they might come to understand what Eloise had understood all along: that the true value of our legacy lies not in the objects themselves, but in how we care for them and for each other. And perhaps next time they visit, they might actually listen when I tell them about the portrait of Eloise, painted when she was barely 20, before she began building the collection that would define not just her life, but all of ours. The doorbell chimed again, more insistently this time. I collected our lunch from the delivery person, grateful for the momentary escape from the tension filling my living room. When I returned with the paper bags, my children were huddled in conversation that abruptly ceased as I entered. Victoria, with her arms crossed tightly, James still looking shell-shocked, and Rebecca's face on the laptop screen showing the remnants of tears. "I've ordered your favorites," I said, unpacking containers of pasta and salad onto the coffee table. "Fettuccine for Victoria, penne arrabbiata for James, and I had them include Rebecca's caprese salad even though you can't be here to eat it." The small gesture, remembering their preferences, seemed to disarm them slightly. Victoria uncrossed her arms. James reached for a napkin. On screen, Rebecca wiped her eyes. "So this is it?" Victoria finally asked, ignoring the food entirely. "There's absolutely nothing we can do to salvage the situation. $17 million just gone?" I settled into my chair, arranging my salad on my lap. "The collection was never about the money, Victoria. That's what I've been trying to tell you for decades." "Easy to say when you're not losing your share," she muttered. "I was never going to receive a share," I corrected gently. The trust was very clear. The beneficiaries were Eloise's great-grandchildren only. My role was always as caretaker, not heir. James looked up sharply. "Wait, you never stood to inherit any of it? Even after all these years of maintenance and care?" "No," I confirmed. My compensation was being able to live with these beautiful things, to study them, to preserve them for the next generation. I considered it a privilege, not a burden. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, not quite softening, but recalibrating. "You've spent your entire adult life maintaining a collection worth millions that you never stood to inherit." I smiled faintly. I received other gifts from Eloise: my education, seed money for my conservation business, this house. But the collection was always meant to pass directly to you three, provided you demonstrated the necessary respect for it. "Which we failed to do," Rebecca said quietly from the screen. "Yes," I agreed, not unkindly. "You did." Victoria set her untouched container of pasta on the coffee table with deliberate control. "I need to understand exactly what happens now," she said, her lawyer's mind clearly working overtime. "The Foundation takes possession of everything, both what's still here and what we've removed. Then what?" "The Foundation will inventory and assess each piece," I explained. "They'll determine which items should be donated to museums, which should be displayed in the Foundation's own gallery spaces, and which might be sold to fund their preservation work. And our obligation is to return everything we took, intact and undamaged," James confirmed. "Yes," I said. "By next Friday." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And if we don't?" "Hypothetically speaking." I set down my fork and met her gaze directly. "Then Margaret will be obligated to report the items as stolen property with their full valuation. The police would become involved." "You'd press charges against your own children?" Victoria challenged. "I wouldn't have a choice," I replied, evenly. "As trustee, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the Foundation now that the trust conditions have been breached. I would be legally liable if I didn't report the theft." The calculated look in Victoria's eyes told me she was still searching for a loophole, some way to recover what she now understood she had lost. "What if we've already sold something?" James asked, not meeting my eyes. My heart sank. "Have you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "The tea caddy. A collector saw it at the restaurant and made an offer I couldn't refuse. I thought—" He stopped, swallowed. "I honestly thought it was just a nice antique box worth maybe a couple $1,000s. I closed my eyes briefly. The rosewood? Tea caddy had been one of Eloise's first acquisitions, a piece with particular historical significance beyond its monetary value. "How much did you sell it for?" I asked. $15,000, he admitted. "I used it to upgrade the kitchen equipment." According to the inventory, the tea caddy's actual value was closer to $120,000. I didn't tell him that. "You'll need to get it back," I said simply. "Whatever it takes." James nodded, his face grim. "I'll call the buyer today." The afternoon stretched on, heavy with recrimination and regret. Victoria barely touched her food, her mind visibly racing through scenarios and calculations. James ate mechanically, his usual enthusiasm for fine cuisine absent. On screen, Rebecca sipped tea, her eyes red-rimmed but dry now. "I think I need to see the trust document," Victoria eventually said. "The actual text, not just your summary." I had anticipated this. I went to my desk and returned with copies of the trust agreement, 57 pages of dense legal language drafted by Eloise's attorneys nearly 50 years earlier. "It's all there," I said, passing them around. "Every detail, every condition, every consequence." Victoria immediately began reading, her lips moving slightly as she analyzed the document. James flipped through his copy more randomly, pausing occasionally to read a section more carefully. Rebecca asked me to email the PDF to her, which I did. While they read, I cleared away our mostly uneaten lunch and made tea. The familiar ritual, heating water, warming the pot, measuring leaves, calmed me. I had known this day might come ever since they began taking pieces of the collection. I had even prepared for it. But I hadn't anticipated how deeply it would hurt to see their shock, their sense of betrayal. When I returned with the tea tray, Victoria looked up from the document, her expression guarded but less hostile. "This is remarkably comprehensive," she admitted. "Grandmother Eloise didn't leave any room for misinterpretation." "No," I agreed. "She was quite thorough." "The thing I don't understand," James said, running a hand through his hair, "is why you didn't just tell us outright about the conditions. Don't touch anything or you'll lose millions." That would have been pretty effective. It was a fair question, perhaps the most honest one they'd asked so far. "I considered it many times," I admitted. Especially when you were younger and more reckless. But Eloise had been explicit in her instructions to me. She believed that knowing about the money too soon would distort your relationship with the collection, make you see the pieces only in terms of their monetary value, not their historical or artistic significance. That's exactly what's happening. Now, Victoria pointed out. Yes, I acknowledged. But the difference is that now you're adults who made choices with consequences. If I'd told you when you were children, you'd have grown up seeing these pieces only as dollar signs waiting to mature, not as objects with their own integrity and stories. So instead, you told us nothing and let us make a catastrophic mistake. Victoria countered, her voice rising again. I told you everything about the pieces themselves, I corrected. Their histories, their craftsmanship, their significance. I tried to instill appreciation and respect. The only thing I withheld was the monetary valuation and the specific terms of the trust. Because grandmother didn't trust us, Rebecca said softly from the screen. I considered this. She didn't trust wealth to motivate the right kind of care, I said carefully. She'd seen too many collections dispersed by heirs who saw only price tags, not cultural heritage. James had been staring out the window, but now he turned back to me. The foundation, you said it does preservation work? Trains conservators? I nodded. Among other things, yes. They've restored over 24 historic homes across the country, funded museum acquisitions when important pieces came on the market, established scholarship programs for students studying art history and conservation techniques. So the collection isn't just being confiscated as punishment, he said slowly. It's going to support work that aligns with what grandmother believed. Exactly, I said, surprised and touched by his insight. The collection will continue to serve the purpose Eloise intended, preserving our cultural heritage, just not within our family. Victoria was now reading specific sections of the trust document with intense concentration. There's a clause. Here about material breach of trust conditions, she said. It specifies that unauthorized removal of items constitutes such a breach. But what if we could prove the removal was temporary and without intent to permanently separate items from the collection? I shook my head. The language is quite clear, Victoria. Any unauthorized removal beyond the property boundaries constitutes a breach, regardless of intent or duration. But that's absurdly strict, she argued. What if there had been a fire or flood? Wouldn't emergency removal be justified? There are provisions for emergency situations, I explained, but those require trustee approval and documentation. What you three did was deliberate and concealed. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. They had known what they were doing was against my wishes. They had coordinated their actions, timed them for when I was away, never discussed them openly with me. I still don't understand why you didn't stop us earlier, Rebecca said. You must have noticed things missing before now. Of course I noticed, I said quietly. I've lived with these pieces for decades. I know when something is moved an inch, let alone removed entirely. Then why wait until now? She pressed. I took a slow breath. I kept hoping you would come to me voluntarily, that you would recognize what you were doing was wrong, not just against the rules of the trust, but disrespectful to me and to your heritage. I wanted to give you the chance to make the right choice on your own. Victoria's laugh was hollow. Well, that backfired spectacularly. Yes, I agreed sadly. It did. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the living room. Outside, a neighbor's child rode past on a bicycle, the whir of wheels and a burst of laughter briefly intruding on our somber gathering. Life continuing. As normal, while within these walls, everything had changed. I need some air, James announced suddenly, standing up. May I use the garden, Mom? I nodded, and he strode out through the French doors, shoulders tight with suppressed emotion. Victoria watched him go, then turned back to me. "You realize this changes everything," she said quietly. "Not just the money, but our relationship. You've been sitting on this information for decades, watching us make a devastating mistake without intervening." Her words stung, but I met her gaze steadily. "I've been honoring a commitment I made long before any of you were born," I corrected. "And I did intervene, Victoria. Every time I asked you not to move pieces, every time I explained the importance of keeping the collection intact, every time I tried to teach you about provenance and history, that was me intervening." "Not effectively," she snapped. "Perhaps not," I conceded. "But I was trying to respect both Eloise's wishes and your autonomy as adults. I couldn't force you to care about these things. I could only hope you would choose to." Rebecca had been quiet, but now she spoke up from the screen. "Mom, if you had to do it over, would you have done anything differently?" I considered her question carefully. "I would have tried harder to engage your interest when you were younger," I said finally. "Found ways to make the history come alive. For you. Helped you form your own connections with the pieces instead of just listening to my stories. Beyond that, I don't know." The trust terms were Eloise's to set, not mine to change. Victoria stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden, where James was pacing among the late-blooming roses. "I've built my entire retirement plan around the assumption that this inheritance would come through," she said, her back to me. "I've made career choices, investment decisions, all based on that expectation. I never promised you that money," I reminded her gently. "You made those assumptions on your own." She turned, her expression both angry and wounded. "Because, what else was I supposed to think? You've spent your entire life preserving this collection. Why would anyone do that if not for the eventual payoff?" The question revealed so much about how fundamentally she had misunderstood me, and perhaps herself. "There are rewards beyond monetary ones, Victoria," I said. "The satisfaction of stewardship, the connection to history, the beauty of living with extraordinary things." "Easy to say when you have a roof over your head and food on the table," she retorted. "Yes," I agreed. "But you've had those things. Too. All your life. Your father and I made sure of that." She fell silent, perhaps recognizing the truth in my words. Her passion had never been about survival, but about accumulation. The nice house in Boston had become the nicer house in Brookline, then the even nicer house in Cambridge. The practical car had become the luxury car, then the collection of luxury cars. Enough had never been enough. James returned from the garden, his expression calmer, more resolved. "The buyer of the tea caddy isn't answering my calls," he said. "I've left 3 messages. Keep trying," I advised, "and if necessary, be prepared to offer more than you received. It may be the only way to get it back." He nodded grimly. "I know." Rebecca had been quiet again, but now she leaned closer to her camera. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice small but steady. "Those jade figurines I took, I had them appraised here in Zurich. The dealer said they were exceptional Ming Dynasty pieces. She offered 60,000 euros for just one of them." My breath caught. The jade collection had been among Eloise's most treasured acquisitions. "Did you sell it?" She shook her head quickly. "No, but I was considering it. Tyler's job isn't paying as well as we expected, and the cost of living here is insane." She paused. "The dealer said the whole set together would be worth several $100,000. The inventory values them at just over $500,000 for the complete set of 8, I said quietly. Rebecca's eyes widened, and I just took them, packed them in my suitcase between sweaters. The recklessness of it made me shudder. Priceless, fragile artifacts treated like travel souvenirs. "You'll need to bring them back, Rebecca. All of them, properly packed this time." "I will," she promised. "I can fly back next week." Victoria had been watching this exchange with a calculating expression. So let me understand the timing here, she said slowly. You've known we were taking things for months, but you waited until now to reveal the trust conditions. Why now specifically? I set down my teacup. Because it had become clear to me that you weren't going to stop, that the collection was being systematically dismantled piece by piece, and because Victoria's 50th birthday is approaching, when you would have learned everything anyway. So you decided to accelerate the timeline, she concluded, rather than let us continue in ignorance until my birthday. Yes, I confirmed. It seemed kinder than allowing you to continue making a mistake with such serious consequences. Kinder, she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. I'm not feeling the kindness at the moment, Mother. I didn't respond to her sarcasm. Instead, I rose and walked to a small secretary desk in the corner of the room, one of the pieces that had somehow escaped their attention. I unlocked the top drawer and removed a leather-bound notebook. This is the collection catalog, I explained, returning to my seat. Not just the inventory and valuations, but the stories behind each piece. Where Eloise found them, why she chose them, how they're connected to each other and to our family history. I opened the book carefully. Inside, Eloise's neat handwriting filled page after page, accompanied by small watercolor illustrations, and pressed leaves or flowers from places she'd visited. This was meant to be part of your inheritance as well, I said, turning the pages slowly. The contextual knowledge that gives the collection its true significance. James leaned forward, genuinely curious for the first time. May I see? I passed him the book. He began turning pages with unexpected care, pausing to read entries, studying the illustrations. After a few minutes, he looked up at me, his expression complex. She wrote about everything as if it were alive, he said. Like each piece had its own personality, its own journey. Yes, I agreed, smiling slightly. That's exactly how she saw them. Victoria moved to look over his shoulder, her professional reserve melting slightly as she saw the careful documentation, the personal notes, the small sketches. I had no idea this existed, she murmured. You never asked, I said simply. Rebecca strained to see through the screen. Can you hold it up closer? I want to see it too. James obliged, angling the book toward the laptop camera. Rebecca's face softened as she glimpsed the pages. It's beautiful, she said, like a journal and an art book combined. Eloise worked on it for over 40 years, I told them. I've continued it, adding notes about conservation work and additional research findings. For a brief moment, their shared interest in the catalog created a pocket of harmony in the room, the first since they'd arrived. It didn't erase the tension or the sense of loss, but it showed a glimpse of what might have been if they'd approached the collection with curiosity instead of entitlement. The moment passed when Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, then straightened. I need to take this, she said, stepping into the hallway. James continued, reading the catalog, now genuinely absorbed. The tea caddy belonged to a lady-in-waiting to Queen Charlotte, he read aloud. She used it to store secret correspondence during the Regency crisis. He looked up at me, stricken. I had no idea. Each piece has a story like that, I said. That's what I've been trying to tell you for years. Rebecca leaned forward on her screen. Mom, can you scan the catalog and send it to me? I'd like to read about the jade pieces before I pack them up. Yes, I promised. I'll do that tonight. Victoria returned, her expression tight. That was my investment advisor, she said flatly. I had to tell him to cancel the property purchase we were discussing, the one that depended on my inheritance coming through next year. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would ease her disappointment or sense of loss. I'm going to need some time to process all this, she continued, gathering her purse and the trust documents. I'll return everything I took by Friday as required. But after that, she paused, choosing her words carefully. After that, I think we'll need to redefine our relationship, Mother. The formality of mother rather than mom wasn't lost on me. It was a deliberate distancing, a withdrawal of warmth. I understand, I said quietly. Take whatever time you need, Victoria. She nodded stiffly, then turned to go. At the doorway, she hesitated. The Harrington Foundation, is it based locally? Will they keep the collection in this region? Their headquarters are in Boston, I said. Most of the collection will likely remain there, though some pieces may be loaned to museums around the country. She nodded again, processing this information. At least I'll be able to visit them, she said, more to herself than to me. Then she was gone, the front door closing firmly behind her. James watched her go, then turned back to me. I should head out too, he said, his voice heavy, with regret. I need to keep trying to reach that buyer about the tea caddy. He stood awkwardly, the catalog still in his hands. Should I? He began, offering it back to me. Keep it for now, I suggested. Read about the pieces you took. Understand what they really are before you bring them back. Gratitude flickered across his face. Thanks, Mom, I will. He bent to kiss my cheek, a gesture that felt both familiar and newly tentative. I'm sorry, he whispered. I really am. After he left, it was just Rebecca and me, connected by the glow of the laptop screen. The room felt emptier, the silence more pronounced. What will happen to the house? She asked after a while. When all this is over? I'll stay here, I said. The trust provides for me to remain as caretaker of the property for the rest of my life, if I choose. After that, it goes to the foundation as well. She nodded, then asked the question that perhaps mattered most. And what about us, Mom? What happens to our family after this? I sighed, suddenly feeling every one of my 73 years. That depends on all of us, Rebecca. Relationships can survive disappointment and change, but only if there's a foundation of respect and care to build on. Is there? She asked. Softly. After everything that's happened? I considered her question carefully. I believe so, I said finally. Not because of the collection or the money, but because of the years we've shared, the love that exists despite our mistakes. We'll need to find a new way forward, that's all. She wiped away a fresh tear. I hate that we're having this conversation. Through a screen. I wish I could hug you right now. You'll be here next week, I reminded her. We'll have time then. Yes, she agreed. And I promise I'll bring everything back exactly as it was. After we said goodbye and the screen went dark, I sat alone in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the pieces of Eloise's collection that remained, the ones my children had overlooked or deemed less valuable. I ran my fingers over the marquetry of a small side table, feeling the smoothness achieved by centuries of gentle use and careful polishing. The house felt different now. The secret I'd carried for decades had finally been spoken aloud, changing everything. In some ways, it was a relief. No more pretending, no more careful omissions. But the cost had been high. My children's trust in me, their sense of security about the future, their belief in their own place in the family legacy, all of it shaken, perhaps irreparably. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a small glass of sherry, an evening ritual I'd adopted from Eloise herself. Standing at the window overlooking the garden, I thought about the path that had led me here. I had spent my life preserving beautiful things, teaching others to see their value. But in focusing so intently on the objects, had I neglected the more important legacy, the relationships that gave those objects meaning? The telephone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Margaret Chen, calling to check on me after the difficult conversation with my children. "How did they take it?" she asked without preamble. "About as well as you'd expect," I replied. "Shock, anger, bargaining. Victoria's already pulled away. James is more remorseful. Rebecca seems caught, somewhere in between. And how are you holding up?" I considered the question. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. Part of me feels I've failed them somehow, despite following Eloise's instructions to the letter. Another part feels relieved that the truth is finally out in the open. "You haven't failed anyone, Irene," Margaret said firmly. "You've honored your commitment to Eloise and given your children every opportunity to demonstrate the values she hoped they'd develop. The choices they made were their own." "Perhaps," I said, "but I can't help wondering if there was another way, some approach that would have preserved both the collection and my relationship with my children." "Second-guessing won't change what's happened," she reminded me gently. "All you can do now is move forward. The Foundation representatives, will be there Monday morning at 10 to begin the inventory. Will you be ready?" "Yes," I assured her. "I've already started compiling records of what's missing and where each piece has gone." "Good," she said. "And Irene, remember that you're not alone in this. The Foundation understands how difficult this situation is for you. They're prepared to handle your children with sensitivity." After we hung up, I wandered through the house, taking inventory of what remained and what was missing. In the library, the empty space where the writing desk had stood seemed to pulse with absence. In the dining room, the sideboard looked bare without the silver candelabra. Upstairs, the guest bedroom felt strangely unbalanced. Its carefully curated, symmetry disrupted by the missing porcelain and small furnishings. Yet even with these gaps, the house retained a sense of harmony, of purpose. The remaining pieces still spoke to one another across time and space, still created conversations between eras and styles. Eloise had understood this, the power of context, of relationship. Objects gained meaning from their proximity to other objects, just as people were shaped by their connections to others. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of my reflection in the antique pier glass that had hung in my bedroom for decades. I looked tired but composed, my silver hair neatly coiled at the nape of my neck, my posture still straight despite the emotional weight of the day. I recognized Eloise in my features suddenly, the same determined set of the mouth, the same clear-eyed gaze. "I did what you asked," I told her reflection. "I kept the collection safe as long as I could. I tried to teach them its value. And now?" I paused, considering. "Now we'll see what lessons they take from this, what kind of legacy they build for themselves." I turned away from the mirror and opened my bedside drawer, removing a small leather journal. My own, not Eloise's. I had started keeping it the day I noticed the first pieces missing, recording not just what had been taken but my feelings about the emerging pattern of behavior. Tonight, I added a new entry, documenting the day's difficult conversations and my hopes for what might come next. The simple act of writing calmed me, helped me process the swirling emotions of the day. By the time I closed the journal and turned out the light, I felt a measure of peace returning. Not acceptance exactly, but a recognition that this chapter of our family story was still being written. The ending wasn't yet determined. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking not about the valuable objects that had been scattered, but about the moments throughout my children's lives when I'd glimpsed their better natures. Victoria's fierce protection of her siblings when they were young, James's natural generosity with friends, Rebecca's quiet compassion for struggling classmates. Those qualities were still there, beneath the layers of ambition and entitlement that adult life had accrued. Perhaps this crisis would strip away those layers, revealing again the children I had raised. The weekend passed quietly. None of my children called, though Rebecca sent a brief email confirming her flight details for the following week. I spent Saturday organizing documentation for the Foundation representatives, pulling together condition reports, conservation, records, and acquisition history for each piece of the collection. On Sunday, I visited Edward's grave in the small cemetery near our church. I hadn't been in several weeks, and the late autumn rains had left the stones slightly mossy around the edges. I cleaned it carefully, then set down the small bunch of chrysanthemums I'd brought from the garden. "The children know now," I told him, adjusting the flowers. "About Eloise's collection, the trust, everything. It didn't go well, Edward. They feel betrayed. By me, by circumstances, by their own choices. I'm not sure where we go from here." The stone remained silent, of course, but speaking the words aloud helped organize my thoughts. Edward had always been my sounding board, the calm center around which our family had revolved. His absence these past 5 years had left a void that nothing could fill. "I keep wondering what you would have done differently," I continued. "Whether you would have told them sooner, or found some way to help them understand the value of what they had before they lost it." A light breeze stirred the chrysanthemums, bending their bronze heads slightly. "But I suppose that's the heart of it, isn't it?" I mused. "We can't really understand the value of anything, objects, relationships, time itself, until we've experienced loss. Maybe that's what Eloise understood all along." When I returned home, there was a message on my answering machine from James. "Mom, it's me." His voice sounded strained but determined. "I've found the tea caddy. The buyer is willing to sell it back, but he's asking for $40,000. I don't have that kind of money right now, but I've applied for a loan using the restaurant as collateral. I'll make this right somehow. I just wanted you to know." I sank into a chair, both touched by his effort and dismayed by the new financial hardship he was taking on. The tea caddy wasn't worth ruining himself over. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. "James," I said when he answered, "I got your message. Listen to me. Don't take out a loan. I can speak to the foundation about this. They may be willing to negotiate directly with the buyer. But it's my responsibility," he insisted. "I'm the one who sold it." "Yes," I agreed. "But bankrupting your business won't solve anything. Let me handle this part, please." He was quiet for a moment. "Why would you help me after what I did?" "Because you're my son," I said simply. "And because you're trying to make things right. That matters to me." His breath caught audibly. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice thick. "I don't deserve it. But thanks." After we hung up, I immediately called Margaret Chen at home, explaining the situation with the tea caddy. "The foundation has acquisition funds," she confirmed after hearing me out. "I'll speak to the director first thing tomorrow. If this buyer is legitimate and the piece is undamaged, they'll likely approve the purchase." "Thank you, Margaret," I said, relieved. "I don't want James to suffer more than necessary over this. The foundation isn't interested in punishing your children, Irene," she assured me. "They just want to preserve the collection as Eloise intended." "Speaking of which, have you given any thought to your role going forward? The director mentioned they'd be pleased to have you continue as consulting conservator for the collection, if you're interested." The offer surprised me. They'd want me to stay involved? "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "Your expertise with these pieces is unmatched. The foundation would be foolish not to utilize it." As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself contemplating this unexpected opportunity. Perhaps there was a way forward that honored both Eloise's vision and my own continued connection to the collection. Not ownership, but stewardship, the role I'd always played, now formalized in a new context. And perhaps in time, my children might find their own connections to this legacy, not as owners but as witnesses to a history larger than themselves. It wouldn't be the future any of us had imagined, but it might hold its own kind of meaning, its own potential for growth and understanding. I opened my journal again and added a brief postscript to the day's entry. The collection was never truly ours to possess. We were its temporary caretakers, entrusted with its preservation for a time. Perhaps that's all we ever are in this life, temporary guardians of what will outlast us. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that only comes after significant change. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny messengers between past and present. I had been awake since dawn, preparing for the foundation representative's arrival. Each room had been tidied, each remaining piece of the collection checked and documented. I'd even arranged fresh flowers in the entryway, not out of festivity, but out of respect for the occasion. Some rituals of care persist, even in difficult times. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I smoothed my dress, a simple navy wool that Eloise herself might have worn, and went to answer it. On the porch stood 3 people, a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a neat chignon, a younger man carrying a sleek leather portfolio, and between them, a slender woman with familiar features that made my heart skip. "Mrs. Davis," the older woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Harrington Wright, director of the Harrington Foundation. These are my colleagues, Philip Chen and Dr. Claire Donovan." I shook each hand in turn, my gaze lingering on Claire. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same high cheekbones, the same direct blue gaze that had looked out from Eloise's portrait. "You're related to Eloise," I said, not a question but a recognition. Claire smiled, a small private expression. "She was my great-aunt. I never had the chance to meet her, but I've spent my career studying her collection and her conservation methods." I stepped back, inviting them in. I had no idea Eloise had other family involved with the foundation. "The Harrington family has always maintained a presence on the board," Eleanor explained as they entered. "Claire joined us 5 years ago after completing her doctorate in art history and conservation. She's been instrumental in our preservation programs." I led them into the living room, where I'd prepared coffee and a simple arrangement of pastries. As they settled into chairs, I couldn't help but watch Claire, searching for further echoes of Eloise in her movements, her expressions. She caught me looking and smiled again, more warmly this time. "I hope our visit isn't too difficult for you, Mrs. Davis," she said. "I know how challenging this situation must be." "Please call me Irene," I replied. "And yes, it's difficult, but necessary. The collection deserves proper care and attention. That's what matters now." Eleanor opened her portfolio, removing several documents. "We've prepared a preliminary plan based on the inventory you sent over yesterday. Our team will need approximately 2 weeks to fully document and assess each piece, especially considering those that need to be recovered from your children." I nodded. "Rebecca is flying in from Switzerland on Wednesday. She'll bring the jade collection and several other items. James has located the buyer of the tea caddy, and the foundation has agreed to repurchase it?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Margaret Chen informed us of the situation. We've already contacted the buyer and arranged the transaction. The tea caddy will be returned directly to foundation custody by the end of the week." "And Victoria?" Claire asked gently. I sighed. "She hasn't been in touch since Saturday, but she did say she would return everything by Friday. Victoria has always kept her word, even when she's unhappy about it." Philip, who had been setting up a laptop on the coffee table, looked up. "We've prepared digital files for each piece in the collection. As we examine items, we'll update these with current condition reports and conservation recommendations. Would you be willing to review these with us, Mrs. Davis? Your knowledge of these pieces is invaluable." The request surprised me. "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to." Eleanor and Claire exchanged glances. "Actually," Eleanor said, "we were hoping for more than just your review. The board has authorized me to offer you a formal position with the foundation, Conservator Emerita for the Eloise Harrington collection. You would continue to oversee the preservation of these pieces, guide their transition to foundation custody, and provide historical context that might otherwise be lost." I stared at her. You want me to stay involved with the collection? More than involved, Claire said earnestly. We want you to continue your life's work. No one knows these pieces like you do. The documentation you've maintained is extraordinary, but it can't replace your direct knowledge and expertise. Something tight in my chest began to loosen, a tension I hadn't fully recognized until it started to release. I thought once the collection passed to the foundation, my role would end, I admitted. Eleanor shook her head. That was never our intention. Eloise's will specified that in the event of trust breach, you would remain as lifetime caretaker of the property. We interpreted that to include continued stewardship of the collection itself, in an advisory capacity. I took a moment to absorb this unexpected turn. For days, I had been preparing myself for an ending, a final farewell to pieces I had lived with and cared for over decades. Instead, I was being offered a continuation, a new chapter rather than a conclusion. What would this position entail exactly? I asked, practical considerations replacing emotional ones. You would work directly with Claire, who heads our conservation department, Eleanor explained. Documenting the history and significance of each piece, advising on display and preservation methods, perhaps even participating in educational programs about the collection. The position comes with a stipend, of course, though I understand financial considerations may not be your primary concern. And the collection itself? I pressed. Where will the pieces be housed? Most will go to our main gallery in Boston, Claire said. Some may be loaned to museums with proper security and climate control. A selection of pieces, those with particular significance to the Harrington family history, will remain here, in the house, as part of the historic property preservation. This last detail caught me by surprise. Some pieces will stay here? Eleanor nodded. The house itself is part of the legacy, Irene. Removing everything would diminish its historical integrity. Our goal is preservation of context, not just objects. I found myself unexpectedly moved by their thoughtfulness, their genuine appreciation for what Eloise had created. I would be honored to accept the position, I said finally. Thank you for understanding what this collection means, not just to me, but to history. The rest of the morning passed in detailed discussion of logistics, which pieces would be documented first, how the recovery of missing items would be handled, what role I would play in communicating with my children during the transition. Throughout it all, I found myself drawn to Claire, whose quiet expertise reminded me so much of Eloise herself. During a brief pause while Philip stepped away to make a phone call, I finally asked the question that had been on my mind. Claire, how much do you know about Eloise personally, beyond her work with the collection? She smiled, touching a small silver brooch at her collar that I hadn't noticed before. This was hers, she said. My grandmother, Eloise's younger sister Beatrice, gave it to me when I decided to pursue conservation studies. I've read all of Eloise's journals, her letters, her monographs on preservation techniques. In some ways, I feel I know her intimately, though we never met. She would have liked you, I said with certainty. Your dedication, your respect for the work. Claire's expression softened. That means a great deal, coming from you. My grandmother always said that while Eloise left the collection to her great-grandchildren, she entrusted its soul to you. Now I understand what she meant. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. An unexpected interruption. I excused myself and went to answer it, my mind still processing Claire's words. When I opened the door, I found James standing on the porch, his expression a mix of determination and apprehension. Mom, he said, then noticed the foundation car in the driveway. Oh, they're already here. I can come back later. It's all right, I assured him, stepping aside to let him in. What brings you by? He held up a canvas bag. I brought back the candelabra and the painting. I wanted to return them properly, not just drop them off and run. His thoughtfulness touched me. Thank you, James. Come in and meet the Foundation representatives. He hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on official business. You're not intruding, I said firmly. This is still my home, and you're still my son. Besides, I think it might be good for you to understand where these pieces are going. I led him into the living room, where Eleanor, Claire, and Philip were reviewing documents at the coffee table. They looked up as we entered, their expressions professionally neutral. This is my son, James, I introduced. He's brought back some of the collection pieces voluntarily. Eleanor stood, extending her hand. Mr. Davis, thank you for bringing these items back promptly. It's very helpful to our process. James shook her hand, his discomfort evident, but his manners intact. I wanted to do the right thing, he said simply, and to see where the collection is going. My mother has cared for these pieces my entire life. I'd like to understand what happens to them now. Claire approached, her interest piqued. Which pieces have you brought? She asked. James carefully removed the candelabra from his bag, unwrapping each from protective cloths. These, he said, setting them on the table. And this small painting of sailing ships. Claire's eyes lit up as she saw the candelabra. The Marlborough Commission, she said with quiet reverence. I've studied these in photographs but never seen them in person. James looked surprised. You know about these specifically? Of course, Claire said, examining the hallmarks without touching the silver. They're documented in Thomas Hemming's workshop ledgers. Only 3 pairs were made for the Duke, and this is the only set still in its original configuration. Something shifted in James's expression, a new awareness, perhaps, of what he had so casually removed from the house. I had them in my restaurant, he admitted, on the chef's table for ambiance. I had no idea they were so significant. Claire didn't judge or criticize. She simply nodded. Objects like these have many layers of meaning. Their beauty is immediate, but their historical significance requires context. She gestured to the painting he had also brought. May I? James handed it to her carefully. She held it up to the light, studying the brushwork. Dutch, mid-18th century. The sailing vessels are rendered with remarkable accuracy for the period. It hung in our upstairs hallway my entire childhood, James said. I always liked the way the light hit the water. It reminded me of summer vacations at the coast. Personal connections are valuable too, Claire said, smiling at him. They're part of the object's continuing story. I watched this exchange with growing interest. Claire's approach, respectful, educational, without being condescending, seemed to reach James in a way my decades of attempted teaching had not. He was listening, truly listening, perhaps for the first time. Eleanor, observing the same interaction, stepped forward. Mr. Davis, would you be interested in seeing our preliminary plans for the collection? As a family member, your perspective could be valuable. James glanced at me, surprise evident in his expression. You want my input? The Foundation's goal is preservation and education, Eleanor explained. Understanding how these pieces have been experienced by the family helps us contextualize them for future generations. James hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that, yes. For the next hour, James sat with us as Philip walked through the digital catalog, explaining how each piece would be documented, conserved if necessary, and eventually displayed. Throughout, Claire added historical context, while Eleanor outlined the Foundation's educational mission. James asked thoughtful questions, his initial discomfort gradually giving way to genuine interest. The tea caddy, he said at one point. The one I sold? You mentioned the Foundation has arranged to buy it back? Eleanor nodded. Yes, the transaction should be completed tomorrow. James looked down at his hands. I'd like to cover that cost, he said quietly. Not now. I don't have the funds immediately available, but over time, I want to make that right. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. We can discuss a payment arrangement that wouldn't place undue hardship on you. The Foundation's primary concern is recovering the piece, not punishing the family. Thank you, James said, his relief evident. Then he turned to me. Mom, I'm sorry about all this. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know. I know, James, I said gently. And I appreciate you coming today. It means a lot. When the Foundation team prepared to leave around noon, having completed their initial assessment of the pieces in the living room and library, James surprised me by offering to help carry their equipment to the car. Outside on the porch, I overheard him speaking quietly with Claire. Is there a way for family members to visit the collection once it's installed in the Foundation galleries? He asked. Of course, she replied warmly. We're not cutting family connections to these pieces. We're helping preserve them for future generations, including yours. You'll always be welcome to visit. Thank you, he said. I think I'd like that. Maybe I could bring my kids someday, when I have them. Help them understand this part of their heritage better than I did. When they had gone and James and I were alone in the kitchen, he accepted my offer of lunch with an ease that had been missing between us for years. As we prepared a simple meal of soup and sandwiches, he spoke more openly than he had in a long time. Those people from the Foundation, they're not what I expected, he admitted, slicing tomatoes for the sandwiches. I thought they'd be cold, judgmental, treating us like thieves. What did you expect? I asked, stirring the soup. The Foundation was created by Eloise herself. It reflects her values: preservation, education, respect for beauty and history. I guess I never really thought about it that way, he said. In my mind, the Foundation was just this faceless entity that might someday take everything away. I never considered that it might be made up of people who actually care about these things. People like me, I said quietly. He looked up, a flash of recognition in his eyes. Yes, he agreed. Like you. I think I understand a little better now why you've spent your life doing this. It's not just about the objects themselves, is it? No, I confirmed. It's about the connections. Between past and present, between maker and user, between generations. Each piece tells stories that would otherwise be lost. He nodded slowly. The director mentioned you're going to continue working with them. As some kind of advisor? Conservator emerita, I said, unable to keep a note of pride from my voice. I'll be helping document the collection and guide its preservation. That's good, he said with unexpected sincerity. You should be recognized for your work, Mom. All these years I thought you were just, I don't know, playing house with fancy antiques. But it's been real work, hasn't it? Important work. His acknowledgement brought a lump to my throat. Yes, I managed. It has been. We ate lunch in a companionable quiet that felt both new and familiar, like returning to a place I'd visited long ago in dreams. When he left in the early afternoon, his goodbye was warmer. His promise to return, later in the week with the remaining pieces, seemed more genuine. Alone again, I moved through the house, taking note of the areas the Foundation team would assess tomorrow. In the dining room, I paused by the empty space where the candelabra had stood for decades. James had returned them, but they would soon leave again, this time properly documented, properly valued, bound for a place where they would be appreciated for their true significance. The thought brought less pain than I'd expected. Perhaps because I now understood this wasn't truly an ending, but a transition. The collection would live on, not in the way Eloise had originally planned, but in a manner that still honored her intentions. And I would continue to play a role in its care, no longer its sole guardian, but still its advocate and interpreter. My reverie was interrupted by the telephone. I answered to find Margaret Chen on the line, her voice concerned. Irene? I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just heard from Victoria's lawyer. My heart sank. Victoria has a lawyer involved now? I'm afraid so, Margaret confirmed. Franklin Wald from Preston and Wald. He's requested all documentation related to the trust, claiming there may be grounds to contest the breach determination. I sank into a nearby chair. On what grounds? He's arguing that the removal of items was temporary and done with the intention of keeping them within the family, which he claims is in line with the spirit, if not the letter of the trust. That's a stretch, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. The trust language is very clear about unauthorized removal. It is, Margaret agreed. But he's essentially trying to create ambiguity where none exists. It's a delay tactic, most likely. But I wanted you to know that Victoria is clearly not accepting the situation as easily as James seems to be. After we hung up, I sat motionless, absorbing this new complication. Victoria had always been the most strategic of my children, the least willing to accept defeat. Her legal challenge didn't surprise me, but it saddened me deeply. While James was finding a path toward understanding and acceptance, Victoria was digging in, preparing for battle. I picked up the phone again and dialed her number, not really expecting her to answer. To my surprise, she picked up on the third ring. "Mother," she said coolly. "I assume Margaret Chen has already called you?" "She has," I confirmed. "Victoria, is this really necessary? Bringing in lawyers will only make things more difficult for everyone." "I'm exercising my legal rights," she replied, her voice clipped and professional. "The trust terms may be open to interpretation. I'm simply ensuring that interpretation is fair to all parties." "Fair," I repeated. "Victoria, the Foundation representatives were here today. They're reasonable people who care deeply about the collection and its history. They've even offered me a position to continue working with the pieces. There's room here for cooperation, not conflict." "How convenient for you," she said with an edge of bitterness. "You get to keep your precious antiques and your role as their guardian. Meanwhile, what was supposed to be our inheritance vanishes into a foundation none of us control." "That's not fair," I protested. "I didn't force any of you to take those pieces. I tried repeatedly to explain their significance, the importance of keeping the collection intact." "Without ever mentioning the financial consequences," she countered. "That's called withholding material information, Mother. Any competent court would recognize that." I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Victoria, please. The Foundation isn't some faceless enemy. They're continuing. Eloise's work I've dedicated my life to. Fighting them will only create more pain for everyone, including you." "I'll be the judge of what causes me pain," she said coldly. "My lawyer will be in touch with the relevant documents." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me with the hollow echo of the dial tone. I replaced the receiver slowly, my hand trembling slightly. Of all the outcomes I had feared, this bitter legal battle was perhaps the worst. Not just for the potential damage to the collection, but for what it revealed about the gulf between Victoria and me. The doorbell rang again, jarring me from my troubled thoughts. When I opened it, I found Claire Donovan standing on the porch, a leather portfolio under her arm. "I'm sorry to disturb you again, Irene," she said. "I realized I left some documentation you might want to review before tomorrow. Eleanor asked me to drop it off on my way back to the hotel." I invited her in, grateful for the distraction from my conversation with Victoria. "Would you like some tea? I was just about to make some." "That would be lovely," she accepted. In the kitchen, as the kettle heated, Claire spread her documents on the table. Conservation assessments for several key pieces, including the jade figurines Rebecca would be bringing back from Switzerland. "These are preliminary recommendations only," she explained. "We'll want your input before finalizing anything." I studied the papers, impressed by the level of detail and the sensitivity to the piece's history. Your approach is remarkably similar to what I would have suggested, I noted. She smiled. That's not coincidence. I've studied your conservation methods extensively. Your monograph on the preservation of organic materials and mixed media decorative arts was essentially my Bible during graduate school. I looked up in surprise. You've read my monograph? Read it? I practically memorized it, she said with enthusiasm. Your techniques for micro-cleaning of ivory and horn inlays are still the standard in the field. Didn't you know? I hadn't known. For decades, I had worked quietly, documenting my methods and findings in journals I assumed would be read only by a handful of specialists, if anyone at all. The idea that my work had influenced others, had contributed to the field, was both startling and deeply moving. I've always believed that proper conservation is an act of respect, I said after a moment. Each piece has its own integrity, its own story. Our job is to listen before we act, to understand before we intervene. Yes, exactly, Claire agreed, her eyes bright with shared conviction. That philosophical approach is what drew me to your work in the first place. It's not just about techniques or materials, it's about relationship with the objects in our care. As we continued talking over tea, moving from specific conservation questions to broader philosophical discussions, I felt a growing kinship with this young woman who carried Eloise's blood and, it seemed, her spirit as well. In Claire, I glimpsed what might have been possible with my own children under different circumstances, a shared passion, a continuation of values across generations. May I ask you something personal? Claire ventured after a while. Your children. I understand they didn't develop the same appreciation for the collection that you have. Was that difficult for you? I considered her question carefully. Yes, I admitted. More difficult than I usually acknowledge, even to myself. I wanted them to see what I saw, to feel what I felt when looking at these pieces. Their indifference, sometimes, even their resentment, was painful. Claire nodded thoughtfully. My grandmother used to say that appreciation can't be forced, only invited. Some invitations are declined. A graceful way of describing rejection, I observed with a sad smile. Or a hopeful one, she countered. Invitations can be reissued. People change. I've seen it in my work with museum patrons. Someone who begins with complete indifference to historical objects can develop profound connection over time with the right guidance and opportunity. You think there's still hope for my children? I asked, not entirely convinced. I think James's visit today suggests at least the possibility, she said diplomatically. And even Victoria's resistance indicates engagement of a sort. She wouldn't fight so hard for something she truly didn't value. Her perspective gave me pause. Perhaps Victoria's legal maneuvering wasn't merely about money or control, but represented in its own distorted way a form of attachment to the legacy she felt was being denied her. I've spent so many years focusing on preserving objects, I said slowly. Perhaps I've neglected the more important work of preserving relationships. Claire reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, a gesture of understanding from someone who, despite our short acquaintance, seemed to grasp the core of my dilemma. It's not too late, she said simply. After Claire left, I remained at the kitchen table, contemplating her words. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the garden. From this window, I could see the old oak tree where Edward had hung a swing for the children decades ago. Victoria had been fearless, pumping her legs, to go higher and higher, while James preferred to spin in circles, twisting the ropes until they could unwind in a dizzying spiral. Rebecca, the youngest, had often been content just to rock gently, observing her siblings' more dramatic play. The memory reminded me that they had each always had their own ways of engaging with the world, their own perspectives, their own priorities. Perhaps I had been expecting too much and hoping they would all develop the same appreciation for the collection that I had. Perhaps what mattered now was finding new ways to connect with each of them that honored who they had become, not who I had wished they would be. With this thought in mind, I returned to the living room and opened Eloise's collection catalog. Turning to the pages that documented the pieces Victoria had taken, I began to write additional notes. Not about provenance or conservation, but about connection. The writing desk Victoria had removed had been where she had written her college application essays. The small Persian rug had been where she'd played as a toddler, arranging her toys in careful rows. The leather-bound Shakespeare volumes had been the source of quotations for her high school debate competitions. These personal histories wouldn't appear in any official documentation, wouldn't affect market value or historical significance. But they represented a different kind of provenance. The story of how these objects had been part of a family's life, had witnessed their growth and changes, had formed the backdrop for ordinary moments that, in retrospect, seemed precious. When I had filled several pages with these memories, I closed the catalog and reached for the telephone. Victoria wouldn't answer if I called again today, I knew. But perhaps there was another way to reach her, not through legal arguments or appeals to duty, but through our shared history, the connections that existed before and beyond the collection itself. Tomorrow, I decided, I would write her a letter. Not a rebuttal to her legal challenge, but a mother's recollections of a daughter's life among beautiful things. Whether it would change her mind about the legal action, I couldn't know. But at least it would remind us both that some legacies can't be measured in dollars or documented in legal briefs. They exist in memory, in relationship, in the quiet spaces between people who, despite everything, remain connected by bonds deeper than disagreement. As night fell, I moved through the house turning on lamps, their warm glow creating pools of light that transformed the rooms. In each illuminated space, the remaining pieces of the collection seemed to take on new life, their surfaces reflecting the light, their shadows creating patterns on walls and ceilings. They remained beautiful, remained valuable. But now I saw them differently. Not just as precious objects to be preserved, but as witnesses to a family's story, a story still being written, still capable of new chapters and unexpected turns. Tuesday morning, I woke to the sound of rain, tapping against the windows, a gentle rhythm that seemed to echo the measured pace of my thoughts. The house felt different now. No longer solely my domain, but a space in transition, halfway between private home and public trust. I dressed carefully in preparation for the foundation team's return, choosing a sage green blouse that had been a favorite of Edward's. Over breakfast, I composed a letter to Victoria, setting aside legal arguments to focus instead on memories. Dear Victoria, I wrote, last night I was looking at the empty space where your father's desk used to stand, the one you played beneath as a child, hiding with your dolls while I worked on restoration projects nearby. Do you remember how you would arrange your toys as if they were having important business meetings? Just like Daddy, you would say, your small voice so serious. When I finished, I sealed it in an envelope. I would mail it today, hoping it might remind her of the human connections these objects represented. The doorbell rang just before noon. When I answered, I found Rebecca standing on the porch, rain-dampened and travel-worn, but with a tentative smile. Mom, she said, setting down a carry-on bag. My flight got in early. I hope it's okay that I came straight here. I embraced her, feeling her slim shoulders tense briefly before relaxing into the hug. Of course it's okay. You're always welcome here. She stepped back, glancing past me to where Eleanor was visible in the dining room with the other foundation representatives who had arrived earlier. I brought the jade pieces and everything else. I wanted to return them properly. Rebecca set a protective case on the table, opening it carefully to reveal the jade collection, each piece nestled in custom foam. I want you to know I took good care of them, she said, her voice slightly defensive. I didn't just throw them in a suitcase. Claire, The young conservator who had particularly impressed me with her connection to Eloise stepped forward. "This is excellent care," she confirmed. "You clearly understood their fragility." As Claire began documenting each jade piece, Rebecca watched with evident fascination. Unlike Victoria's combativeness or James's initial discomfort, she seemed genuinely interested in the process, asking questions about how certain aspects were assessed and documented. "The jade animal figures were always my favorites," she said, nodding toward a small carved rabbit being photographed. "When I was little, I used to make up stories about them, imagining they came alive at night and had adventures throughout the house." "I remember that," I said softly. "You called the rabbit emerald because of the color, even though it's jadeite, not emerald." She smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of her childhood self. "I had names for all of them. The tiger was Shadow, the crane was Whisper." Claire looked up from her documentation. "That kind of personal connection is wonderful," she said warmly. "It's exactly the sort of engagement we try to foster through our educational programs, helping people see historical objects not just as valuable artifacts, but as sources of imagination and storytelling." Throughout the afternoon, Rebecca remained with us, watching the documentation process with growing interest. She returned to her suitcase periodically, bringing out other items she had taken: the painted chest, several small porcelain figurines, a pair of carved bookends. Each was carefully documented by the team, with Rebecca offering occasional comments about what had drawn her to particular pieces. Later that evening, as Rebecca settled into the guest room, she revealed that she and Tyler were separating. "That's part of why I could come back so easily," she explained. "The move to Switzerland was supposed to be a fresh start, but it just highlighted our differences. He's so focused on his career, on appearing successful. That's why I took the jade pieces. He wanted our apartment to look impressive for dinner parties." I listened, recognizing patterns that had played out in our family for years: the pressure to appear a certain way, to use beautiful objects as props in a performance rather than sources of genuine connection. "I realized I don't want to live that way anymore," Rebecca continued, "always striving for the next promotion, the better apartment. When all this happened with the collection, it made me step back and think about what really matters. About legacy and care and paying attention to things that last." Just as we were preparing for bed, the telephone rang. It was James, his tone urgent. "Mom, Victoria wants to meet with all of us tomorrow at her lawyer's office. She says she has a proposition that might resolve everything." I frowned, immediately wary. "Did she give any details?" "No," James replied. "Just that she's been doing research and thinks she's found a solution that serves everyone's interests." She sounded how not exactly conciliatory, but not as combative as before. The next morning, James drove Rebecca and me to the law offices of Preston and Wald in the financial district. Victoria already waited in a conference room, alongside a silver-haired man I assumed was Franklin Wald. She had dressed for battle, in a charcoal suit and pearl earrings. But there was something different in her demeanor, a focus, a clarity that hadn't been present during our last interaction. "Thank you all for coming," she said formally. "This is Franklin Wald, my attorney." Wald opened a leather portfolio, removing several documents. "Ms. Davis has thoroughly reviewed the trust documentation and researched the Harrington Foundation's operations. Based on this research, she's developed a proposal that acknowledges the trust breach while creating a new pathway forward for family involvement." He slid copies of a document across the table to each of us. "In essence, Ms. Davis proposes the creation of a new entity, the Davis Family Conservation Fund, to be established as a supporting organization to the Harrington Foundation. This fund would be seeded with personal contributions from each family member and would focus on conservation education, family heritage preservation, and acquisition support for the Foundation's collection. Victoria took over the explanation with the precise, measured tone she used in her professional life. "I realize we can't undo the breach," she said directly. "The collection will go to the foundation as stipulated in the trust. But after researching the foundation's structure and mission, I believe there's room for continued family engagement that honors both Eloise's intentions and our family connection to these pieces." She looked at me steadily. "The letter you sent yesterday made me think about things differently, Mother. About my connection to these objects beyond their monetary value." Her acknowledgement represented a significant shift from her previous position. I studied her face, trying to discern her true motivations. "This is a thoughtful proposal, Victoria," I said carefully, "but it would require the Foundation's agreement. I've already had preliminary discussions with Eleanor Harrington Wright," Victoria replied, surprising me further. She expressed openness to the concept, pending board approval. James, who had been reviewing the proposal with increasing interest, looked up. "This could actually work. It's not the same as inheritance, but it maintains our connection to the collection and gives us a way to contribute meaningfully." Rebecca seemed more hesitant. "What kind of financial commitment would this require from each of us?" "I'm not exactly flush with cash at the moment." "The initial contributions would be proportional to means," Victoria explained, "and could include non-monetary contributions such as time and expertise. The point isn't the amount, but the commitment to ongoing involvement." I studied my eldest daughter with new eyes, seeing beyond the corporate armor to the strategic thinker who had found a third path when the original two, full inheritance or complete loss, had been closed. "I think Eloise would approve," I said finally. She valued preservation and education above all. This approach honors those priorities while keeping the family connected to her legacy. Victoria's expression softened slightly. "I thought so too," she admitted. After reading her journals and the Foundation's mission statement, I realized there was more alignment than I'd initially recognized. "You read Eloise's journals?" I asked, surprised. Victoria nodded. "The Foundation has digitized many of them. Eleanor granted me access when I explained what I was trying to develop. They're quite remarkable. Her vision was far more expansive than I'd understood." This small revelation touched me deeply. The image of Victoria poring over Eloise's writings, seeking understanding rather than ammunition. It suggested a capacity for growth I had perhaps underestimated in my achievement-oriented daughter. "The next step," Wald interjected, "would be a formal presentation to the Foundation Board. Having family unity behind it would strengthen the case considerably." "I think we can provide that," James said, looking at Rebecca and me. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I like the educational component especially. I've been helping with documentation at the house, and it's been surprisingly engaging." "Then we're agreed in principle," Victoria concluded, her professional demeanor softening further. "We move forward together, acknowledging what's lost, but focusing on what can still be built." As the meeting concluded and we prepared to leave, Victoria held back, indicating she wanted a private word with me. When James and Rebecca had stepped outside, she turned to me, her expression more vulnerable than I had seen in years. "Your letter," she said quietly. "The memories about the desk and the books. It made me remember things differently. Not just as valuable antiques, but as landmarks in my own history." "That's exactly what they are," I said gently. "Their monetary value matters, of course. But their true worth lies in the stories they contain, the connections they represent." She nodded, a complicated emotion crossing her face. "I'm still upset about how this happened," she admitted. "But I'm trying to find a constructive response, rather than just fighting a battle we can't win." "That shows wisdom," I told her. "And creativity. This fund concept of yours, it's quite brilliant actually. A way to honor the past while creating something new." For the first time in our recent interactions, Victoria smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me forcefully of her younger self. I learned strategic thinking from you, Mother. You've always played the long game. 3 months later, on a crisp winter afternoon, I stood in the newly renovated gallery of the Harrington Foundation in Boston, watching as visitors moved, respectfully among the displayed pieces of Eloise's collection. The foundation board had approved Victoria's proposal with surprising enthusiasm, establishing the Davis Family Conservation Fund as a supporting organization. The fund's first initiative, a series of workshops for families with historical collections, was already oversubscribed. Rebecca had surprised us all by accepting a part-time position with the Foundation's education department, developing programs specifically for children and young adults. Her natural storytelling abilities, combined with her growing knowledge of conservation techniques, made her uniquely suited to translating complex historical concepts for younger audiences. James had contributed in his own way, hosting a fundraising dinner at his restaurant that featured dishes inspired by the historical periods represented in the collection. The event had been so successful that the foundation was planning to make it an annual affair. Even Victoria, despite her demanding career, had found time to serve on the fund's advisory board, bringing her financial acumen and strategic thinking to bear on long-term planning. She and I had begun meeting for lunch every few weeks, still somewhat formal encounters, but gradually warming as we found new common ground beyond our fractured past. As for me, I divided my time between my role as conservator emerita for the collection and my continuing residence in the family home. Several key pieces had remained in the house as part of the historic property preservation, while others rotated between the foundation gallery and museum exhibitions. I no longer felt the weight of sole responsibility, but instead the satisfaction of shared stewardship. Claire joined me by a display case containing the jade collection, now beautifully lit and accompanied by both historical documentation and excerpts from Rebecca's childhood stories about the figures. "The visitor response has been extraordinary," she said, "especially to the personal narratives we've incorporated. People connect with objects differently when they understand the human stories behind them." I nodded, watching as a young family approached the display, a child of perhaps 8 pressing close to the glass to examine the jade rabbit. That's what Eloise understood, I think, that preservation isn't just about protecting physical objects. It's about maintaining the connections between past and present, between generations, between art and life. And that's what the Davis Fund is helping to do, Claire observed, creating new connections even as it helps preserve the old ones. Later that evening, at a small reception celebrating the gallery's official opening, I found myself standing between my 3 children as Eleanor Harrington Wright offered a toast. "To Eloise Harrington," she began, raising her glass, "whose vision created not just a remarkable collection, but a living legacy that continues to evolve. And to the Davis family, who have found a way to honor that legacy through their own creativity and commitment." As glasses clinked and conversations resumed, James leaned closer to me. "I think we did all right in the end, didn't we? Not what was planned, but maybe something better." I glanced around at my children, Victoria engaged in animated conversation, with a museum director, Rebecca showing a conservation technique to an interested young intern, James himself having just arranged a perfect tray of hors d'oeuvres with an artist's precision. "Yes," I agreed, a deep contentment settling in my chest. Something better indeed. The collection would never belong to us in the way Eloise had originally intended. The trust breach had changed that irrevocably. But perhaps ownership had never been the point. Perhaps what mattered was the relationship, to the objects themselves, to their histories, to each other. Not possession, but stewardship. Not inheritance, but legacy. As I moved through the gallery that evening, noting how beautifully each piece had been placed in conversation with others, I felt Eloise's presence, not as a ghost or memory, but as a continuing influence, a thread connecting past to present to future. The collection had found its purpose, not as a private treasure but as a public trust. And we had found our purpose in relation to it, not as inheritors, but as caretakers of something larger than ourselves. 1 year later, I stood in my garden, watching autumn leaves drift across the lawn, their golden and russet colors catching the late afternoon light. The landscape had changed with the seasons, just as my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined when this journey began. The Harrington Foundation's conservation team had completed their work months ago, the most valuable pieces of Eloise's collection now safely housed in climate-controlled galleries or on loan to prestigious museums. Yet the house didn't feel empty. If anything, it felt more alive, filled with purpose rather than just possessions. I bent to cut a few late-blooming roses for the dining room table. Tonight would be special, the first time in years that all 3 of my children would be gathered here for dinner, not out of obligation or crisis, but by choice. The pathway that had led us here had been painful, filled with misunderstandings and hurt feelings, but somehow we had emerged on the other side, changed but intact as a family. The Davis Family Conservation Fund had exceeded all expectations in its first year. What had begun as Victoria's strategic compromise had blossomed into something none of us could have predicted. Under her guidance, the fund had established partnerships with 3 universities, creating internship opportunities for students studying art history and conservation. James had leveraged his connections in the culinary world to host quarterly fundraising dinners that paired historical menus with displays of period decorative arts. And Rebecca, in perhaps the most surprising development, had discovered a genuine talent for conservation work. I smiled, remembering Claire Donovan's call 3 months ago. "Irene," she had said, her voice brimming with excitement, "Rebecca has a remarkable eye for detail. The micro repair she completed on the Ming figurine is museum quality. Has she ever considered formal training?" Now Rebecca divided her time between courses at the Foundation's Conservation Institute and hands-on apprenticeship work. She had moved back to the States permanently, renting a small apartment not far from the Foundation's headquarters. Her divorce from Tyler had been finalized without drama, a clean break from a life that no longer fit who she was becoming. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reflections. I gathered my small bouquet and went to answer it, finding James on the porch balancing a cooler and a canvas bag filled with fresh ingredients. "Hope you don't mind," he said, kissing my cheek as he entered. "I thought I'd cook tonight. Nothing fancy, just a simple cassoulet, but I need your kitchen for about an hour." "Of course," I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. James's definition of nothing fancy had evolved considerably since his restaurant had earned its first Michelin star 6 months ago. We moved to the kitchen together, falling into an easy rhythm as I arranged the roses in a crystal vase, one of the pieces from Eloise's collection that had remained in the house, while James unpacked his ingredients with a chef's precision. "How's the new conservation exhibit coming along?" he asked, dicing vegetables with practiced ease. "Beautifully," I replied. The Foundation decided to feature the restoration process as much as the objects themselves. There's a section where visitors can watch conservators working on actual pieces from the collection. Rebecca's station is particularly popular with children. She has such a gift for explaining complex techniques in ways they understand. James nodded, a smile playing at his lips. Never would have guessed that's where she'd end up. Remember how she used to zone out whenever you talked about preservation methods. "People surprise us when given the chance to find their own connections," I said, thinking of how each of my children had discovered unexpected aspects of themselves through this journey. "You certainly surprised me with that Japanese tea ceremony fundraiser last month." He grinned, the expression lightening his formerly serious face. Who knew that studying the proper way to serve tea would help me rethink my entire restaurant concept? The mindfulness of it, the attention to detail and presentation. It's transformed how I approach food. The front door opened again, and Victoria's voice called from the hallway. "Mother? James? Where is everyone?" "In the kitchen," James called back. Victoria appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed than I had seen her in years. She had finally left her corporate position 3 months ago, trading 70-hour work weeks for a consulting role that allowed her more flexibility. The change suited her. There was a softness around her eyes that had been missing before, a certain ease in her movements. "I brought these," she said, setting a portfolio on the counter. "The foundation board approved the final designs for the new wing yesterday. I thought you might like to see them before the public announcement." I wiped my hands and opened the portfolio, gasping softly at what I saw. The architectural renderings showed a beautiful glass-walled pavilion extending from the main foundation building, surrounded by gardens that mirrored the layout of my own. "The Eloise Harrington Pavilion for Family Heritage," read the elegant lettering above the entrance. "It's stunning," I breathed, turning the pages to see interior views. "When will construction begin?" "Spring," Victoria said, a note of pride in her voice. "The capital campaign is already at 80% of goal. Turns out there are quite a few families with similar heritage challenges who are willing to support our educational initiatives." She didn't mention that her own contribution had been substantial, or that she had personally secured several major donors through her extensive professional network. Victoria had never been one to tout her own achievements, but I knew from Eleanor how instrumental she had been in bringing this project to fruition. The doorbell rang again, and James glanced up from his cooking. "That must be Rebecca. Could someone get that? This sauce is at a critical stage." Victoria went to answer, returning moments later with Rebecca and, to my surprise, Claire Donovan. They entered the kitchen together, chatting animatedly about a conservation conference they had both attended the previous weekend. "Hope you don't mind me crashing your family dinner," Claire said, offering me a warm hug. Rebecca and I were finalizing some details for tomorrow's workshop when she mentioned she was coming here, and she kindly invited me along. "You're always welcome," I assured her, genuinely pleased. Claire had become something of an honorary family member over the past year, her connection to Eloise creating a bridge between past and present that all of us valued. As we moved from kitchen to dining room, carrying dishes and setting the table together, I observed the easy interaction between my children. The gentle teasing, the shared references, the unconscious adjustments they made to accommodate each other's preferences. These small gestures of consideration had been absent during the difficult days of the trust breach, replaced by defensiveness and accusation. Their return felt like watching spring flowers emerge after a harsh winter. Over James's exquisite meal, conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic. Rebecca's latest conservation project, Victoria's plans for the pavilion's educational programming, James's exploration of historical cooking techniques. I contributed occasionally, but mostly listened, savoring not just the food but the moment itself. This gathering of adults who had found their way back to each other through shared purpose rather than obligation. "Actually," Claire said, during a pause, "I have some news that might interest all of you. The Foundation has been offered an extraordinary opportunity. The Whitmore Collection in London, you know, the one with all those exceptional Georgian silver pieces, is being dispersed, following Lord Whitmore's death. His estate has offered us first right of refusal on several key pieces that would complement Eloise's collection beautifully." Victoria leaned forward, immediately engaged. "What's the asking price? Is it within the Foundation's acquisition budget?" Claire shook her head. "Well beyond our current resources, I'm afraid. The Finance Committee is exploring options, but realistically, we may have to pass." James and Rebecca exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Victoria caught it and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked. "You two have that look." Rebecca smiled. "We've been talking, actually, about the trust fund our father left us, the one that matured when I turned 40 last month. Edward's insurance policy," I recalled, surprised they were bringing this up. Edward had always maintained a separate insurance trust for the children, modest but carefully invested, intended to provide them some financial security independent of Eloise's collection. With the turbulence of recent events, I had almost forgotten about it. We've been discussing using part of it to establish an acquisition fund specifically for pieces that complement grandmother's collection, James explained. Not through personal ownership, but as a dedicated resource for the foundation. Victoria's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. That's actually an excellent idea. A targeted fund with specific acquisition parameters would address the foundation's most significant strategic gap. We wanted to talk to you about it tonight, Rebecca added, looking at me, to see if you thought Dad would approve of us using his gift this way. I felt a sudden warmth spread through my chest, emotion catching in my throat. I think he would be deeply moved, I managed after a moment. Edward always understood the importance of the collection, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented: continuity, craftsmanship, beauty preserved through generations. This honors that understanding perfectly. Claire looked from face to face around the table, her expression one of quiet amazement. I have to say, this is quite extraordinary. Most families in your situation, after losing such a significant inheritance, would distance themselves from the collection entirely. Instead, you've found ways to deepen your connection to it. We didn't lose an inheritance, Victoria said reflectively, swirling the wine in her glass. We found a legacy. It just wasn't the one we originally expected. As the evening continued, I excused myself briefly to step out onto the back porch, needing a moment to absorb the fullness of what was happening. The night air was cool, but not cold. Stars emerging in a clear sky above the garden Eloise had first planted decades ago. I had maintained it all these years, occasionally replacing plants but keeping the original design intact, another form of conservation, another thread of continuity. I sensed rather than heard someone join me, turning to find Rebecca standing in the doorway. "Everything okay, Mom?" she asked softly. "Everything is perfect," I assured her, extending my hand in invitation. She came to stand beside me, both of us looking out at the silvered landscape. I've been thinking about what Claire said, about most families distancing themselves from collections they've lost. I think I understand now why we didn't. It was never really about owning the objects, was it? It was about being part of their story. I smiled in the darkness, hearing in her words an echo of what Eloise herself might have said. That's exactly right. We're not owners. We're caretakers of the collection, of its history, and of each other. Rebecca slipped her arm through mine, leaning her head gently against my shoulder, a gesture she hadn't made since childhood. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she said simply. Inside, I could hear Victoria laughing at something James had said, the sound drifting through the open door like music. Claire's voice joined in, then James's deeper tones, the harmony of people connected by more than circumstance. "Come," I said, guiding Rebecca gently back toward the warmth and light. "We should rejoin the others. The story isn't over yet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out."